Well, as John said, I had some difficulty getting here. I'm starting to regard airline schedules as the merest expression of wishful thinking. And if I had tried to give the talk Saturday night, I might have had the distinction of being the only speaker who fell asleep during his own presentation. There is one difficulty, however. The talk was designed as a preparation for our pilgrimage to Santiago. So we're faced with two options. One, everyone forget you went there. Or be patient with me as I try to sort of edit and restructure certain parts so that it sort of makes sense. Okay? This word pilgrimage versus peregrination. Peregrination is an odd word that you don't hear much anymore. It's a Latinate expression, and I used it because it occurred much in the literature during the Middle Ages when pilgrimage was very much in fashion. And it was used in this sense, in a pejorative sense. Peregrination was a corruption of the pilgrimage spirit. It was sort of the tourist spirit versus the pilgrimage spirit. Because a lot of people started going on pilgrimage just to have a good time, which wasn't the idea. Well, with that introduction, we'll get to it and I'll try to make some sense of this for you, I hope. We're getting on and off the bus a lot yesterday, on our way to Santiago and coming back. And it brought back so many memories for me because my father was a bus driver. And not only a bus driver, he was also an agent for the bus company for which he worked. And being an ambitious fellow and having to support us, he used to devise tours to different places up and down the East Coast. He would then sell them as an agent for the company, drive the tour and get a pay as an agent and a pay as a driver. And this allowed him to take an assistant along, me. So from the time I was 10, 11 years old, I started going on bus tours. I would do little things that children can do. I would do all the head counts when people got on and off the bus. I would get room keys at hotels. I would help with the baggage. I would be pleasant to everyone when they pinched me and patted me. And I would also pass out the song sheets. Because my father had a wonderful singing voice, and he loved to sing, and the people loved to sing with him. And one way to while away the monotony of long, long hours of highway travel is to sing old songs. Now, one of my favorite excursions that I used to go on was called the Shrine Tour. This is a tour we put together for Catholic groups. It would start in Philadelphia in one of the Catholic parishes, and then we would work our way up along New England to a place called Our Lady of La Salette in New Hampshire. I don't know what it's like today, but it was a beautiful shrine in the 1950s. And then we would go to Cape de Madeleine in Canada, a place called Three Rivers, another beautiful Marian shrine. We would then proceed to Quebec and go into the Laurentian Mountains to St. Anne de Beaupré. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a very impressive place, or used to be. And then we would go to St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, see the preserved heart of Brother Andre. Then we would come back, stop for a night's relaxation on Lake George, and back to Philadelphia again. It was a beautiful tour, and I loved doing it so much. And when we would pull into a shrine, my father would switch his musical repertoire. He'd go from sentimental old-time ballads to singing Marian hymns. So when we were 3 or 4 miles out, we'd start with a Salve Regina or a Hail Holy Queen enthroned above, and we make this triumphal entry into the parking lot of the shrine. Quite often, we'd arrange to have Mass said for the group, special Mass said for the group. And I frequently served as the altar boy. It made no difference that the priest spoke no English and I no French, because the Mass was in Latin then, the rubrics were universal. I could serve Mass for any priest anywhere in the world. And he knew what I was doing and I knew what he was doing, which was a wonderful advantage. The shrine tour remained popular until the mid-1960s. Then interest in the excursion fell off to the point where we couldn't fill a bus, even from the largest parishes. When we still used to go to Canada with touring groups, but now they were secular tours. When we went to Canada, when we went to Quebec, we would never go to St. Anne's anymore. We would go to fine restaurants and the Chateau Frontenac and visit the battlefield and the Plains of Abraham, but we wouldn't go to St. Anne de Beaupré. No one would hear about all the miracles performed by the Mother of Mary. They wouldn't see the wall with all those crutches and wheelchairs and medical apparatus of people that had been cured there. The fact is, we dropped it from the brochure because by 1965, no one was asking for it anymore. That was our last tour. We only had half a bus and we lost money, and we couldn't sell it anymore. Now, I often thought, why did this happen? I don't know. It was so popular that it like fell off the edge of a cliff. And it happened around the mid-60s, and that was the end of the Shrine Tour. Okay? Our Catholic clients still stayed with us, but now they wanted to do other things. They lost interest in the holy places. They became indistinguishable from other secular clients. The fact is, Catholics stopped being pilgrims, and they became tourists. Now, this distinction between pilgrim and tourist has been on my mind a lot lately as I've been preparing to come here. And I think it's a profound one that we ought to consider. It was a commonplace in the church through much of her history to regard the Christian as a soul on pilgrimage. As the Latin expression has it, man is a viator. He has no permanent place here on earth. And the more he tries to establish himself here on earth, the more restless and miserable he makes himself. I'm not very good at Latin, but I do have a little elementary knowledge I've retained from my school days, and now and then I'll pick up St. Augustine and work my way through a few lines. And of course, one of my favorite is one of the most famous expressions of St. Augustine, quia fecisti nos ad te, et inquietum est cor nostrum, donec requiescat in te. And I think that says it all. And I'm prone to think about that and repeat it from time to time, and I think it's something good to have committed to your memory. Indeed, God has created us for himself. He's our only home, our only place of rest. To the extent that we give ourselves to the pursuit of anything other than God, we wander from our sole purpose, the sole reason for our existence, the only point of our being here. Now, many of us here, not everyone, but I suppose many of us here did travel to Santiago de Compostela yesterday. What did we see? Did we see fervent Catholics intent upon a penitential pilgrimage? What did we see? We saw tourists, the turistos, everywhere, snapping their cameras, milling about, making noise in the church, dressed and undressed in various ways. But the spirit of pilgrimage is not completely dead. I came across some items recently in newspapers in the United States. I'm a newspaper editor, I should explain. I have to keep track of certain stories and publications. One involved a group in the western United States who made a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Francis Cabrini, a 50-mile march over 2 days. One young man made the trip barefooted. The reporter from the local secular newspaper was there to greet them because they heard this crazy group was walking for 2 days. And this young man arrived at the shrine with his feet bloody and swollen. The reporter looked at him, started questioning him. He said, "Why did you do this mad thing?" And the man said, "There's someone in my family I love very much who's fallen away from the faith, and I'm afraid for their soul. So I'm offering this as a sacrifice to bring them back to the church." His response was published in the newspaper, but how many people who read it understood it? So far have we departed from that spirit of penitential pilgrimage, that sense of sacrifice that is the mark of the Catholic faith. Concerning the spirit of tourism, it is alive and well, as we witnessed, and we could have seen it in full bloom had we been in Portugal on September 27th, where the United Nations celebrated World Tourism Day. Among the contributions to this year's event was a laudatory document issued by a Catholic churchman extolling the many virtues of tourism. It's a very confusing document, a bizarre document at times, I think owing to the attempt to marry two unmarriageable things. But it can be distilled into its basic message. Tourism is wonderful because it reveals to us the richness of humanity. And through that richness of humanity, we can see the face of our Creator. And it is the philanthropic, indeed the evangelistic office of the tour operator to give us this much sought-for epiphany that the tourist desires. Realistic? It ends with a prayerful wish for the success of World Tourism Day. Now, with all due respect, I think we are within our rights to wonder why a senior Catholic churchman would feel compelled to encourage commercial tour operators in a venture which is not consonant with the aims of the faith. Basically, wanderlust and hedonism. Now, we are always obliged to place the best possible construction on the motives of other Christians, and I will grant that the author of the document may have had good intentions, but I think his effort misguided, and perhaps symptomatic of a lamentable tendency on the part of some modern churchmen who, in the name of aggiornamento, will jump aboard any secular bandwagon that's going down the road. They almost think it's their obligation to do so. The document, insignificant in itself, for few will ever read it, and no one will take it seriously, demonstrates a radical departure from the traditional Catholic understanding of man as pilgrim, intent upon his salvation, and a capitulation to the modern notion of man as tourist, intent upon his pleasure. The odd tourist may have the pious thought now and then, but that's not the motive for his travel, nor should it be the subject of undue praise. It is no exaggeration to say that such praise of these quite accidental pious thoughts that may occur to some men would have sent St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bernard into paroxysms of denunciation, for they would have recognized in it the encouragement of curiositas. This is a word you don't hear very much anymore. That worldly curiosity that was so railed against through much of the history of the church. People are even surprised to learn that there's a vast literature on the subject, and that not only within the church, but even within pre-Christian and pagan cultures. Curiosity was considered a dangerous, vile, and often sinful thing. One might even say that the fathers and the doctors of the church regarded it as the midwife of all the deadly sins. It is most often paired with pride and said to be the cause of spiritual blindness. But it is also associated with sloth. In fact, an analysis of the psychological progression of sin assigns curiositas a leading role. For it is from intemperate curiosity about that which is forbidden that we move from suggestion to delectation, and by degrees to full consent. So curiosity has traditionally been regarded much the same way as fire, a thing dangerous in itself and only useful when carefully confined and sparingly fed. Most men now tend to have a high regard for curiosity as something allied and largely responsible to the technological achievements of the modern world. And if the aim of life is material progress, material comfort, this praise is well justified. But the church has never adopted this view. She has always seen life sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, and in so doing, she can only regard material comfort and all the things that come under the heading of progress in relation to whether they aid or hinder salvation. For those who think that all in this life is this side of the grave, the church's attitude toward material progress has always been irksome. It seems to pose an obstacle to the advancement of knowledge, which is judged to be an absolute good. But the church has never been the enemy of knowledge, but rather the arbiter of its relative value. Not all pursuits are equally worthwhile, nor is all knowledge an absolute good. Mankind would have fared much better had a certain woman in a certain garden been less curious to acquire a certain bit of knowledge. Eve would not have been tempted had she not let her eyes stray curiously over the forbidden fruit. So it is from curiosity going beyond its proper limits that all sin and misery have come upon us. And this overarching fact has informed the thinking of our greatest saints and theologians. St. Augustine, in analyzing sins, divides them into three categories listed by St. John: the concupiscence of the flesh, the concupiscence of the eyes, and the pride of life. He says that more dangerous to our salvation than the concupiscence of the flesh is the concupiscence of the eyes. For the flesh only seeks that which is pleasurable to the body, but the eyes go everywhere and want to look at everything, pleasurable or not. And then they place it in front of the mind, and that involves the higher faculties, for the mind feeds on what the eyes see. Now, he's not telling us to walk around with our eyes closed, but he's warning us. Be careful what you look at. Be careful how long you look at it, because therein may lie your fall. The great saint divides knowledge into two kinds, which I'm sure many of you know: sapientia and scientia. Sapientia is knowledge about God. It is good in itself and to be enjoyed in itself. Scientia is knowledge about the physical world and worldly matters. It is only good insofar as it is useful to us in the acquisition of sapientia or in the fulfillment of the duties of our state in life. Scientia has to do with what Augustine calls the useful good. Obviously, from the standpoint of eternity, a man should devote himself primarily, and as far as possible, to the acquisition of sapientia. Too great an occupation with scientia can only imperil our salvation by drawing us away from God and toward the lesser good of created things, which we may mistakenly come to regard as good in themselves, instead of as merely useful. And these created things are a less fitting subject for the great dignity of the human mind because they are perishable. Here we come upon a distinction, a great one, largely forgotten or ignored, that turns our modern world upside down. For St. Augustine, for the perennial mind of the church, that which is immutable truth is the greatest reality. St. Augustine regarded knowledge of revelation as more substantial than material things. The world of visible phenomena is ever changing. Contingent being is here, then it's gone, and one's concern with it should be strictly subordinated to the lasting reality of God. Thus, the world of the senses, which is the very core of reality to modern man, was regarded as the least important and the most ephemeral realm of experience to Augustine. Therefore, to yield to the concupiscence of the eyes, to be forever looking about curiously at the shifting show of this world, is to degrade the mind and to occupy it with either useless distractions or inducements to sin. For St. Augustine, man should be a pilgrim on his way to the city of God, not a tourist touring the city of man. St. Augustine profoundly influenced the church's teaching on curiositas. In the Middle Ages, we find another great figure, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, taking up the theme. Bernard, rooted as he was in the Benedictine tradition, regarded the monastery as the custodian of stabilitas, stability, which directly opposed curiositas. One of the worst class of Christians, as far as Bernard was concerned, were what were called the Gyrovagi, the wandering monks. The Gyrovagi were attached to no monastery, observed no particular rule, and roamed the countryside, serving neither the cause of their own salvation nor that of others, according to Bernard. The Gyrovagi, in their way, were professional tourists, ever traveling to see curious things, making an opportunistic living, attaching themselves to groups of pilgrims, begging at shrines. In contrast, the Cistercian remained rooted in one place, physically and spiritually, averting his eyes from the distractions of the world and fixing his gaze on eternity, It was said of St. Bernard that he observed the monastic rule of keeping his eyes lowered whenever he traveled, so that he might not let his thoughts wander too far on anything that might randomly attract them. I recall once reading a story about St. Peter of Alcantara, who's one of my favorite saints. He lived in a monastery as a young man, a Franciscan place, and he never knew what anybody looked like. I forget how many years he lived there, 6, 7 years. He didn't know anybody's face, because whenever he walked, he would keep his eyes lowered. Amazing. In his writing, St. Bernard devoted considerable space to the prominence and evils of this curiositas. In his famous writing, Steps of Humility, he lists curiositas as the last step before one ascends to beatitude and the first step downward on the path to perdition. He cites the story of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, recounted in Genesis. When Jacob moved his household in flocks to a place near the city of Salem, Dinah became curious about the woman of the place. She decided to go out and make a little tour of inspection. While she was out, she was abducted and raped. This led to no end of trouble, including massive slaughter, the destruction of a city, and we could go on and on. She went sightseeing with disastrous results. St. Bernard writes of her, Tu curiose spectas, sed curiosius spectaris. As we go about looking curiously at this and that, others are looking more curiously at us, sometimes with evil intent. St. Bernard also points to curiosity as the undoing of Eve, and even as the cause of Lucifer's fall. For he exceeded the bounds which it was proper for him to consider, and began to be curious about and to covet that which he had no right to think about. But even Bernard even found fault with certain kinds of religious art, which seemed to him intended to display the inventiveness of the artist and to arouse the curiosity of the observer rather than his piety. He was particularly annoyed by what he considered an extravagant use of imagination in the depiction of gargoyles. But he also tends to raise the huge question of the role of art in the economy of salvation. To what extent it may aid or distract us from prayer. But that is a question for another day. Bernard, in one of his sermons, also lists 3 ways that curiositas may lead those who make their livelihood from knowledge into sin. First, one may learn things merely from an unchecked desire to know. We have many such people about these days, especially among specialists on university faculties. Second, and worse than the first, are those who may learn things so that they may be known. Thus, curiositas serves vanity. Finally, there are those who may acquire knowledge so that they might enrich themselves by it. Thus, curiositas becomes the servant of avarice. Concerning the last point, we can easily see how completely university education is now taken up with enabling people to make more and more money. It would doubtless come as a surprise to many to learn that pursuing knowledge for the sake of money was considered a form of intellectual prostitution and one of the spiritual debasements to which curiositas can lead. St. Thomas Aquinas, as was his way, provides a synthesis of all that those before him had said about curiositas. He acknowledges that there is good and bad curiosity, as did the classical writers, though his division rests on Augustine's distinction of sapientia and scientia. Good curiosity is bounded by what Aquinas calls studiositas, that is, inquiry made for a spiritually useful purpose within the limits imposed by one's state in life. Aquinas also notes that a man may be guilty of curiositas when the object of his knowledge is good, but is attended by something else that is evil. For instance, a man may acquire some degree of sapientia, but more for the sake of pride than sanctity. Think of the publican and the Pharisee. Or he may study something that is good in itself, but less useful than a study he is duty-bound to make, and which he then neglects. A man may also sin through curiositas by studying that which is forbidden, such as the occult. And of course, there is knowledge which is just plain useless and a waste of time. We see a great deal of that sort of knowledge about these days. Some of the men I work with can recite endless lists of sports trivia. And the women can tell you who's married to who in Hollywood, who got divorced in Hollywood, who had what illegitimate baby by whom, so on and so forth. And they just keep acquiring more and more and more of this absolutely useless knowledge through the constant blather of the media. It's epidemic in our society. Of course, the modern world elevates curiosity to a virtue and places no restraint on its exercise on any level. There is no check placed on the wondering eyes or the wondering mind, and whole industries, such as advertising and the entertainment media, exist to encourage and exploit the sin of curiositas. Even among the studious, there is little studiositas, and good minds are wasted in the acquisition of knowledge which is either hopelessly fragmented for lack of a unified purpose, or hopelessly specialized for the sake of material gain. In America, my country, we have a never-ending procession of television shows called quiz programs, in which people win prizes in cash for displaying how much trivial knowledge they have acquired in a great variety of areas. It is curiositas on display, curiositas rewarded and celebrated. Behind this encouragement of curiosity, of learning for the sake of learning, is the hazy notion that sooner or later something good will come of all this haphazard and disconnected gathering of facts. Some new gadget, perhaps, a better microwave or a new mousetrap. One British poet even described modern man in his mad pursuit of curiositas as marching toward the perfect refrigerator. During my student days, there was a very popular book came out just during the 1970s called The Ulysses Factor. And in this book, curiosity, was praised as the very principle of our survival, the engine of our evolution. Now, the use of Ulysses in the title is very provocative, because Ulysses has assumed different roles in our culture during the ages. Dante, of course, places Ulysses in hell. In Canto 26 of the Inferno, Ulysses confesses that it was his unchecked curiosity that led to his death and the death of his men. Nothing, says Ulysses, could check the hunger in my restless mind to learn the vice and valor of mankind, nor quench the zeal that burned within my breast to probe the unknown world beyond the west. Dante invents the episode in which Ulysses makes a final voyage in later life into unknown waters, where he and his men are drowned in a storm. And although Ulysses is in hell principally because of his deceit, he's in the eighth circle of the deceivers, it is plain that along with his gravest sin, he is equally guilty of unbridled curiositas. Augustine also disparages Ulysses for his presumption, for wanting to know things beyond his station in life. So the classical Greek hero in medieval thought, in Christian thought, becomes the mythical representative of that intemperate curiosity of mind that leads men both to physical and spiritual destruction. But Ulysses underwent a kind of rehabilitation closer to our time, in which his curiosity, far from consummating his demise, becomes his claim to our admiration. In a magnificent poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, we find Ulysses as an old man, still obsessed by wanderlust, about to abandon his duties as husband, father, and king, and set off on yet another adventure. But whereas in Dante's poem, Ulysses' account of his restlessness is the remorseful tale of a damned soul, in Tennyson, these very excesses of curiosity are the ground of his nobility and the claim he has to our admiration. Tennyson presents Ulysses as the superior man who simply cannot settle for the mediocrity and humdrum of common life. Ulysses regrets not his wandering, but his temporary surrender to stability, which he calls vile, and then declares his yearning, quote, to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. What we see expressed here is the elevation of the curious man into the romantic seeker, the questing knight of the modern world, so to speak, who will push back the frontiers of knowledge by his bold and relentless curiosity. Of course, Ulysses lived in pre-Christian times, and Tennyson may be excusing his curiosity as a spiritual yearning for a truth not yet revealed. For Ulysses also says, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. But that untraveled world for the pagan has been revealed to us by Christ and in Christ. So modern man can have no such excuse for his vagabond ways. But he doesn't think he needs one. Curiositas is no longer regarded as the midwife of sin, but as the mother of invention. And we so dearly love our inventions, especially in my country. Other nations may revere their saints and great poets. We admire Thomas Edison. Our school children may know little of history or geography or religion, but they will know the inventor of the light bulb. And they will also know that Fulton invented the steam engine, and that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and that Henry Ford invented the assembly line. And of course, that George Washington Carver invented peanut butter. Perhaps I should explain for those who don't know, peanut butter is a very popular American luncheon food. It's made out of crushed peanuts and other ingredients, and you spread it on bread. And it's so important in our culture that we honor the man who invented it. In fact, a little aside, I remember a TV commercial not many years ago in which a venerable old gentleman is sitting on a park bench. And he has a little bag he sits down next to him. His grandson is playing in the grass, and he finally comes up to him, "Grandpa, Grandpa." And the man takes a peanut butter sandwich out of the bag and hands it to him. And it's made with a venerable old brand of peanut butter called Peter Pan peanut butter. And the man looks dead into the camera and he says, "These days, you gotta believe in something. Peter Pan's been around for a long time." A mighty peanut butter is our Lord. But people will ask, well, if we hadn't let curiosity have free rein, so many of these marvelous inventions we have wouldn't be with us. But they will never ask whether any of these things have ever helped a person save his soul. The question doesn't seem important to them. Not many years after Tennyson wrote Ulysses, and not so many years before the Ulysses Factor was published, T.S. Eliot, the great British poet, wrote a poem called Choruses from the Rock, in which he looks at the supposed virtues of curiositas, the accomplishments of our unbridled curiosity, and he writes, "Endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer our ignorance, and our ignorance brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" So for Eliot, our consummate curiosity about the physical world has caused us to descend from wisdom to knowledge and from knowledge to mere information, which may be defined as that scattering of facts that litter the landscape of the average mind like so much flotsam and jetsam floating in the Dead Sea. How do we come to this pass? That is a large question to which various answers have been given. Some historians of thought believe that the nominalists of the late Middle Ages, who separated religion and science, removed the restraints on inquiry that a circumspection about the dangers of curiositas had kept in place. If religion was to have nothing to say about our investigation of the natural world, its role is radically reduced. It becomes a compartmentalized pursuit, more or less like a hobby that some men find diverting and others do not. It also means that our pilgrimage in life is no longer toward a heavenly Jerusalem, but toward that perfect refrigerator. When will modern man see the madness of this way of life and turn back to God? When will he cease to be a gawking tourist and become again a proper pilgrim? One might say that is up to God, to the dispensation of his grace. But God has given us the dignity of cooperating with that grace. So it is also up to us, and more especially up to those who are successors of the apostles, to our good bishops and to our good priests who are appointed to lead us on the road to God. But all Catholics must realize that we are indeed pilgrims on this earth, that every day, the moment we set our foot out of bed, we are either on the road to God or on the road away from him. And each day's progress or regress will depend on how well we resist the lures of curiositas and make our eyes single so that our whole body may be full of light. It is recorded that in the 14th century, as a group of pilgrims made their way to Santiago de Compostela down the French road, a priest blocked their way and began to preach to them, declaring that St. James was in heaven, not in Spain. And they would do best to return to their parish church and pray in front of their altar where Christ was present in the sacrament. Well, we can sympathize with this good priest and agree that he spoke the truth. But perhaps he also lacked a certain imagination that might have allowed him to appreciate the advantages of making a physical pilgrimage. We tend to become creatures of routine. We go to our place of business and do that which brings us the money we need to live. We eat our meals and tend our households. We also allow certain amusements, of course. It is to be hoped we give some time to the thought of our salvation, some time to God, but certainly not as much as we might, or nearly as much as we ought, for he should fill the whole of our lives. But duty and custom and the round of earning our daily bread tend to dull the spirit. This was recognized in times past. Before the vacation became an institution and sightseeing the main occupation of the vacation, people went on pilgrimage. Not always with the best motives. Chaucer's Wife of Bath illustrates the profanation of pilgrimage that many of the sterner moralists came to identify with the practice, the embodiment of curiositas, peregrinatio. She went about to see and to be seen with the basest intentions. But many devout people would go on pilgrimage with the correct intentions, to remind themselves that their true home was heaven. It was easier to do this when one was removed from the tedium vitae that consumed the better part of one's thoughts and energy. The pilgrim, before leaving home, would go to confession, hear Mass, be invested with his pilgrim's cloak and staff, and set off to earn the indulgence Mother Church offered to those of her children who would travel to the holy places. Travel then was not so easy as it is now, although some might argue. And it was fraught with many more dangers. The pilgrim had no guarantee that he would survive the several months of trekking through strange lands. But should he die on pilgrimage? He knew that his salvation was as near to certain as is any man's, so his fears were lessened. Pilgrimage is not the ordeal it was formerly, but it is still not wholly without its perils. Some of us may not return from this pilgrimage we're making. Disease and death are ever our companions. And now there is this element of madness in the world. When we were at Santiago the other day, I saw some people admiring Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer. Would it be possible that sometime, when pilgrims are admiring Santiago Matamoros, some jihadist would run in, shout, Allahu Akbar! Blow himself, the statue, and the tourist up? Is that beyond the realm of possibility or even probability these days? No. Our lease on life is ever more tenuous. And the point of pilgrimage is to remind us of this. Now, one other thing about Santiago de Compostela that I think should be mentioned. Catholics came to pray there from the 9th century. But the shrine is also intimately connected with what was called the Reconquista, the taking back of Spain from the Moors. Santiago was actually destroyed, the church there, in the 10th century by Al-Manzur, an Islamic chieftain, who took the bells and hung them in a mosque. Well, with the aid of St. James, the Christian forces rallied, defeated him, took the bells back, forced him and his men to carry them back, in fact, to Santiago de Compostela. Spanish knights used to go to Santiago before they went into battle, to ask for his grace and protection. They used to go there after they came back from battle to thank him for the victories he had given them. So Santiago is a place that has drawn both pilgrim and warrior. And there is a sense, a deep Catholic sense, in which the two are one. One of the motifs for describing the spiritual life, along with that of pilgrimage, is that of combat. There is a justly famous and invaluable treatise by Lorenzo de Scopoli called The Spiritual Combat, which St. Francis de Sales carried in his pocket and called the Dear Book. And of course, the Ignatian exercises, which have formed so many saints, have a decidedly martial tone. The sacrament of confirmation also used to be viewed as a kind of investiture in spiritual knighthood. Now they make kids clean up highways. Children were taught that to be confirmed is to become a soldier of Christ in the great warfare for the human soul. And now we have with us again a reminder of the spiritual combat, the physical combat with Muslim fanatics. Whether one supports the wars taking place now in Iraq and Afghanistan, it cannot be denied that Islam is on the rise in the West. Our great cities have been the scenes of carnage in the name of Allah. New York, London, Madrid, Paris, Moscow, all have been the targets of violence, and the bodies are piling up. When will it end? Not in the foreseeable future. We are told that more people in England now pray weekly in mosques than in Christian churches. And the largest mosque in the world is, does anyone know? Rome. Christianity in Europe is undeniably in a moribund condition, and Islam is in full vigor and gaining adherents in the countries that were formerly Christendom. More than 70 years ago, Hilaire Belloc predicted that Islam was not done with the West, despite all appearances to the contrary, and that a clash of faiths was inevitable. He based his prediction on the fact that although Islam was then economically prostrate and technologically backward, it was culturally intact, and that a culture that preserves its integrity retains its power over its adherents. We now see the fulfillment of that prophecy. And as distressing as it may be to the great devotees of dialogue, there are just some people not interested in conversation. The man that straps a bomb about his waist, intent upon his martyrdom, is not interested in finding common ground with you. The fact is that today, many men awoke with a single thought of how they might win the world for Allah. How many of us woke today with a single thought of how we might win the world for Christ? How many of those Catholics we saw at Santiago de Compostela came to the shrine in a fervor of faith to equal the intensity with which a Muslim approaches Mecca. What did we see at Santiago de Compostela? We walked into the main square, and we were greeted by the magnificent sight of a giant inflated Coke bottle next to a platform where rock music was playing, some sort of commercial presentation. So we go to one of the holiest shrines of Christendom, and what is on the square? The symbol of the magic elixir the West pours into the holy grail of American capitalism, Coca-Cola, and rock music, perfect together. We go inside the church, and what do we see? The milling tourists, the noise, the disrespect, the immodesty, but more than that, there was a mass about to take place, and the choir director was training the people on how to chant chants that came from the Taizé community, the Protestant ecumenical community in France. Now, I call it Protestant, but I could easily call it agnostic, because it's a community that says the truth doesn't matter. What matters is good fellowship. We don't care what's true. We'll build on good fellowship. Forget truth and dogma. Our Lord never said that. Our Lord said the truth will make you free. And God is the truth. And if you build on anything other than the truth, you're not building your house upon God, and it will fall. And the fall of that house will be great, we are told. So why was the Coca-Cola bottle out in the square? Because an agnostic chant was going on inside the cathedral. Where is the Catholic warrior spirit? Where is the spirit of pilgrimage? I didn't see it in evidence. Our Lord said that the children of wickedness are wiser in their generation than the children of righteousness. Our wickedness in the West is found in our dedication to wealth and pleasure. In America, our vanity contends with our gluttony, and we now spend more money on gimmicks to lose weight than is spent on food in many poorer countries. People are starving, we take diet pills. And the disapproval of the West and of America is not so much fueled by disapproval of our decadence, but by envy. The wickedness of the East, of Islam, is found in its faith in a false god, in a deity fabricated by Muhammad. This false god calls for the blood of the infidel, whose choice is conversion or death. Say Allah or die is their missionary effort. When we look at the Muslim fanatic, we see a deranged killer. When he looks at the West, he sees a godless abomination. In a contest between the God of Islam and the God of the belly, who will win? In truth, no one, for neither side champions the truth. Christ is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life, the only name under heaven given us for our salvation. Christ did not take upon himself our human nature so that he might do some sightseeing. To walk in the way of truth, to walk in Christ, we must cease being tourists and once more become pilgrims. We must keep the eyes of our body lowered to the earth, the ground of our humility, and keep the eyes of our spirit raised to heaven, the hope of our salvation. And if we do this, we will have heaven's help. Finally, God does not do anything by accident. And it can be no mere coincidence that the supernatural event of modern times occurred in Fatima. When a Muslim hears that name, he thinks of the revered daughter of Muhammad. When a Catholic hears that name, he thinks of the mother of Jesus. The town of Fatima is so called because it was there that a Catholic, the son of the church, took for his wife the beautiful daughter of a Muslim chieftain named Fatima, and named the town after her. Through Mary's intercession, in a way that we may not imagine, this event may be writ large for all of Islam. and carrying Mary's banner, the pilgrims of the East may join the pilgrims of the West in the march toward the heavenly Jerusalem, which is the true and only home of every man. Thank you.